The National Museum of Military Vehicles has a total of 27 half-tracks. 8 fully restored half-tracks are sitting inside the museum. Another 17 half-tracks are sitting outside waiting for restoration. 2 additional versions of half-tracks are at our restoration shop. We'll take a look at them later. We use those for parade vehicles. The first 2 half-tracks we developed in World War II were the M2 and M3 half-tracks. White Motor Company developed the M2, while Diamond T Motor Car Company developed the M3. The M2 and M3 were designed, standardized, and introduced at the same time. They were developed in conjunction with an engineering committee that both White and Diamond T participated in to ensure a common design and almost all interchangeable parts. Let's look at the details of the M3 first. Every M3 came with one of 2 things attached to the front bumper, either a 10,000-pound capacity winch or an unditching roller like you see on this particular M3. The purpose of this unditching roller was to make it easier for the half-track to cross a ditch instead of having the front bumper dig into the back wall of the ditch and potentially hang up the vehicle. The unditching roller would lift the front wheels out of a ditch and facilitate crossing. You see the entire body covered with armor, including the radiator. You see in the early versions of M3 half-tracks, the headlights were mounted on the fender. I'll come back to that later because this turned out to be a disadvantage and was modified later in the war. The engine of every M2 and M3 series half-track was exactly the same engine. It was a 6-cylinder gasoline engine manufactured by White Motor Company, generating 147 horsepower. As we move further back, here we see, again in the early half-tracks, you see that this windshield did not fold down as it does in later versions that we'll see. Instead of folding down, it had an armored flap that could be raised or lowered, and here you see the disadvantage of glass in that front windshield. Now let's take a look at the track and suspension system. So this really is the defining characteristic of a half-track in relation to a Scout car. The Scout car obviously had back wheels. On the half-track, the back wheels have been replaced with the tracks that you see here. So this is a vertical volute spring suspension system, bogie assembly, dual road wheels, a center guide to keep the wheels on that track. The track system provided far better cross-country capability for cross-country travel in contrast to the Scout cars. As we look up here at that side armor, you see that this is a solid steel plate, no folding capability, no hinge, as we'll see on some later versions of half-tracks. Now let's go around to the rear. Given the common design of the M2 and the M3 half-tracks and all of the interchangeable parts, they look awfully similar. It can be hard to tell the difference. If you're looking at a single half-track and you want to figure out, is this an M2 series or an M3 series, come around to the rear. The distinguishing feature is the M3 half-track body extends to the rear 10 inches further than the body of the M2. On the M2, the body ends right along in alignment with the rear of the track. On the M3, the body extends beyond the rear of the track, like you see here. Now, while we're at the rear of the half-track, take a look at these corners. The M2 and M3 rear corners are square. That's a result of face-hardened steel armor manufactured in flat plates and therefore bolted together, generating that square corner. You'll see a different corner on the International Harvester. Now let's come around to the very rear and take a look at this door. The M3 half-track had a rear door. The M2 half-track did not. The idea of it here is, first, with this 10-inch longer bed, the M3 has a troop carrying capacity of 13 people. The M2 had a troop carrying capacity of only 10 people. Let's look at some of the other interior features of the M3. You see 2 fuel tanks just behind the front seat on either side. On the M2, there were multiple machine gun mounts. On the M3, just a single pedestal mount behind the front seat. Here you see a water-cooled M19 17 30 caliber machine gun, which is what was really dominant very early in World War II, but as the war went on, it would be more common to see an air-cooled M19 30 caliber machine gun on this pedestal mount, or a 50 caliber machine gun on this pedestal mount. Since the M3 originally was designed as a personnel carrier with all of this room for a rifle squad, we needed a lot of storage as well to carry the gear, to carry weapon systems, other accoutrements for the rifle squad. You see storage behind the seats, you see mounts for personal weapons. Underneath the floors, additional storage. I mean, every little bit of space here on the M3 half-track was put to good use. You see a pintle hitch on the rear of the half-track. This could also be used to tow artillery or tow other trailers. Very utilitarian design. This covers the highlights of the M3. Now let's go take a look at the M2 half-track. The best vehicle we have here in the museum to show you the defining characteristics of an M2 is this one. Now, technically, this particular half-track is an M4 Mortar Carrier, but the outside of the M4 Mortar Carrier is exactly the same as the outside of an M2 half-track. So let's look at those features. Here again, just like with the M3 on the front bumper, we have either an unditching roller or a 10,000-pound capacity Tulsa winch. This particular one shows you the winch. You see the same armor throughout. A difference, not so much of M2 to M3, but a difference of this particular M2 is you see the headlight is no longer mounted on the front fender. The headlights now are removable and they're attached to the armor. I'll come back to the significance of that. Moving back, I'll just pull down this armor driver's window, so to speak. I want to get to the ammunition storage boxes. So this is a big visual clue for you. If you're looking at a half-track and wondering which version of half-track it is, if it has an ammunition storage box behind the front seat on each side of the half-track like this one does, it's an M2. The M2 originally was intended to be a prime mover. Prime mover just means designed to tow artillery. The secondary function of the M2 was to serve as a reconnaissance vehicle. And because this was intended to tow artillery storage ammunition boxes were built into the half-track, one on each side. Let's move further to the rear of the half-track. You see exactly the same track and suspension system on the M2 as on the M3, no difference at all. On this particular M2, you see a rack has been added to hold anti-tank mines. Coming back to the rear corner, you see the same 90-degree angle, the same face-hardened steel armor bolted together. You see that the rear body lines up with the rear of the half-track rather than extending along further. But what you do see here differently than the M3 is you see a platform extending outside the armored body. It's just a platform for more storage capacity to haul more gear. As you look at the interior of this half-track, ignore the mortar features for the moment. If you ignore the mortar features, everything else that you see in this interior are characteristic of an M2 half-track. The first thing is the machine gun mount. Instead of the pedestal mount found in the M3, the M2 had a skate rail mount that goes all the way around the interior of the half-track so that machine guns can be positioned anywhere along that rail. Number one. Number two, in addition to a primary mount on the skate rail, the skate rail also had an additional socket for a 30 caliber machine gun or potentially another 50 caliber machine gun. But the main point here is the M2 was designed to mount multiple machine guns while the M3 was designed to mount only a single machine gun. Now, I don't know why the M2 had mounts for multiple machine guns as an artillery prime mover. Might be partly because of the secondary role of the M2 as a reconnaissance vehicle. If anybody has good insights on that, please share them in the comments. Another nit about the M2 different than the M3, because of the ammunition storage boxes, which extended into the interior so that you could access ammunition from inside the half-track, that forced the fuel tanks to be relocated to the rear of the M2, as you see here. So that's it. Those really are the differences between the M3 and the M2. In World War II, White and Autocar manufactured just over 11,000 M2 half-tracks. White, Autocar, and Diamond T together manufactured just over 12,000 M3 half-tracks. The M4 Mortar Carrier was designed and standardized exactly the same time as the M2 and the M3, but the M4 wasn't introduced until later in the war. So let's look now at what makes this an M4 instead of an M2. It's the mortar mount and the mortar. In addition, a rear door has been added. So those are the differences. The mortar was rearward facing. It wasn't designed to be fired from this position except in an emergency. It had very limited traverse. The design intent and the reason for this door was the crew was supposed to open the door and then take the mortar off this mount and move it underneath this skate rail to then fire the mortar from the ground. Not very practical. So the disadvantages, obvious disadvantages of the M4 led to the M4A1. The difference between the M4 and the M4A1 is a mount was added. It's still rearward firing, but a mount was added so that the mortar could be traversed further from side to side. Now, I think this particular M4 is actually an M4A1. You see this fixture, mortar mount with capability to traverse side to side, and I'm not sure that this is exactly the rail that was added to facilitate traverse, but I think it is. If any of you have information to the contrary, please add your comments. In addition to the M4A1 mortar carrier variant, a second variant designated the M21 was created. The M21 reversed the direction of the mortar from rearward firing to forward firing. That mortar carrier was built on an M3 chassis rather than the M2 chassis. That additional 10 inches was thought appropriate to be able to reverse the mortar, eliminate the skate rail, instead have a single pedestal mount for a single machine gun to be mounted on that pedestal behind the forward facing mortar. Now, I'm going to talk further about the M21 when we go over to the restoration shop, but M21 mortar carriers are extremely rare. White Motor Company manufactured only about 110 of them during World War II. Now let's go backward in time and relocate to our restoration shop to add to the evolution of American half-tracks in World War II, the story of the half-tracks manufactured by International Harvester. Early 1942, before the M4 mortar carriers began to be manufactured, the Army Ordnance Department already was concerned that White Motor Company, Autocar, and Diamond T might not be able to manufacture enough half-tracks, so they issued a contract to International Harvester to add to the mix. The International Harvester version we see here, an absolutely pristine example of the M5 half-track, was almost the same as the M2 or M3, but there were three particular differences I'll cover in a minute. Because of these differences, International Harvester half-tracks had their own designation. The International Harvester version of the M2 was designated the M9. The International Harvester version of the M3 was designated the M5. So two subtle differences and then a major difference. The first subtle difference is on the front fender. You see a little different configuration, a flat surface connecting to the armor on the half-track that is missing on the M2 and the M3. Just for visual identification, one can look at that part of the front fender on each side. A more important difference is the engine in the M9 and the M5 was an International Harvester engine instead of the White Motor Car engine. The International Harvester engine was substantially the same in performance. It was a 6-cylinder gasoline engine. It generated about the same horsepower as the White version. Both engines supported a top speed of about 45 miles an hour or 72 kilometers an hour. So really it was just a manufacturing gain, not a design change to have its own engine. The most significant difference in the International Harvester half-track is a difference in the steel armor. International Harvester manufactured its armor from rolled homogeneous steel instead of face-hardened armor used for the M2 and the M3. Now, both provided similar protection, similar I say, and I'll get back to that in a second, but the main difference with rolled homogeneous steel armor is you could shape it. So you see here, instead of bolting the armor together, you see the armor welded, And at the rear corner, instead of a sharp corner, you see a rounded corner, possible with rolled homogeneous steel. It was not possible with face-hardened steel armor. Coming around to the rear, you see that we have the same kind of rear door in this particular M5. This is configured as a personnel carrier. You see seats for 13 people. Just behind those front seats in the middle, you see a location for the pedestal mount we reviewed in the M3 over at the museum. The pedestal mount itself is missing from this particular restoration. It's something that we'll add going forward in the future. What I should add is rolled homogeneous steel armor. I said that it had substantially the same level of protection. It doesn't really. The rolled homogeneous steel has less ballistic protection as applied to the M5 and the other International Harvester variants. It was built up to provide similar ballistic protection by adding additional thickness and another 500 pounds of weight. Now the M9, although it was designated and standardized, the M9 was never manufactured. The M9 would be the equivalent of the M2. Remember, the M2 had that skate rail. By the time the M9 was ready for manufacture in March of 1943, we already had upgraded the skate rail machine gun mount to a single ring mount. And so the very first, otherwise would have been M9s that were manufactured, were actually manufactured as M9A1s. No skate rail, a ring mount, additional side sockets for additional machine guns on either side. International Harvester added the ring mount before White, Autocar, or Diamond T. So actually the A1 designation originated with the M9A1. Then subsequently, later in 1943, the M2 similarly was upgraded to a ring machine gun mount and redesignated M2A1. The M5 similarly was upgraded to an M5A1. Instead of the single pedestal machine gun mount, there was a ring mount and additional sockets for side mount of machine guns. Now, I don't have an M9A1, I don't have an M5A1, but I wanted to refer to them just for completeness in discussing the evolution of American half-tracks. International Harvester manufactured more than 4,600 M5 half-tracks in World War II, and all of the half-track companies together manufactured more than 12,000 A1 variants of the M2, the M3, the M9, and the M1. That covers the International Harvester half-track. Now let's transition to the second half-track we have here in the restoration shop. At first blush, this half-track looks like an M2 half-track, but it's not. And I'll tell you why. As you look at the front portion of this half-track, it is an M2. It's exactly the same as you'd see on an M2. It has the length of bed of an M2, but look at what's different. The ammunition storage boxes are not located just behind the front seat. Instead, they're located toward the rear. That's one thing. You see the porch, typical of an M2, to the rear of the body. And as you come around to the rear, however, you see what used to be a door, but it's been plated over. So there's no door at the rear of this particular half-track. Now let's climb inside, which is where it gets really interesting. Once we get into the interior of the half-track, the mystery deepens. You can see this is configured as a mortar carrier. The data plate refers to it as an M4 mortar carrier, but this isn't an M4 mortar carrier. The M4 mortar carrier has a door at the rear. This has been plated over. The M4 mortar carrier has a mortar mount for rear firing. This has a mortar mount for forward firing. Right away, my mind goes to, okay, is this an M21 with a forward firing mortar? And it's not. The M21 was manufactured on the M3 chassis, not the M2 chassis. The M21 was long enough, the bed of the half-track was long enough to have a machine gun mount behind the mortar. There's not room in this M2 chassis for a machine gun mount behind the mortar. So this is just something bizarre. There's no model reference for this. This version of half-track was never standardized. My theory is that this is a field conversion, possibly done by the 2nd Armored Division, while the 2nd Armored Division was waiting for the Army Ordnance Department to standardize what came to be the M21. I see in the literature that the 2nd Armored Division did its own field modification to create forward-firing mortar carriers while it was waiting for the M21 to become available. And this may have been one of those. If any of you have a better idea than my theory on what this is and what we should refer to it, I think it's just a customized field modification, please weigh in our comments. This covers the 2 half-tracks here in the restoration shop. Now let's go back to the museum and finish covering the different variants of half-tracks on display in the museum. This next half-track is an upgrade to the M2 half-track, an M2A1. The exterior of the M2A1 is exactly the same as the exterior of the M2. The only difference is the machine gun mounts. Let's take a look inside. This half-track was converted from an M2 to an M2A1. You can see the remnants of the machine gun mount skate rail characteristic of an M2. The skate rail's been cut, and instead of the skate rail machine gun mount, you see a ring mount for a 50 caliber machine gun or a 30 caliber machine gun. This particular ring mount has armor added around it. The very first versions of ring mounts did not have armor, so this is a little bit later version and upgrade on the ring mount itself. In addition to the ring mount, for the primary weapon, there were 2 additional socket mounts to mount machine guns on either side of the half-track. So those are the differences. Those upgrades made this an M2A1. Now, at the same time that we made the upgrade to the M2 with this change in configuration of machine gun mounts, we made exactly the same changes to the M3, converting the M3 into an M3A1. While we're inside this M2A1, let's look at some of these other interior features. First, you notice that this does not have a rear door, which is absolutely correct for an M2. We saw that rear door in the M4 Mortar Carrier, but that was added after the fact. It was manufactured without a rear door. Another thing that strikes me here is this particular M2A1 is configured as a personnel carrier. It wasn't its primary role, but it could be used as a personnel carrier. So here you see 3 seats each on either side in the rear, back-to-back seats in the middle, driver right-hand front seat, a total capacity of 10 passengers in the M2A1. In addition to using half-tracks as mortar carriers, the United States used the half-track platform to mount a variety of other weapons during World War II. I'm going to cover only the varieties we have on display here in the museum, beginning with the one you see behind me, a T-19. The T-19 was never standardized. It was just a kludged together stopgap version of a 105 millimeter self-propelled howitzer while the United States was developing the M7 Priest self-propelled howitzer. Now, this was really not a very effective weapon system. The gun was too powerful for the platform. The half-track had to be strengthened in the middle to help support the recoil from the 105. In the end, we manufactured only 324 of these between January and April of 1942. Diamond T Motor Company is the company that manufactured all of these. Now, just a couple other nits before we move on to the next half-track. First would be to see that here, to accommodate the 105, we have a fold-down version of a front windshield. Secondly, I want to point out here the headlights. This is the original version of headlight mount on the fender. Now, the T-19 in particular, as well as some other versions we'll look at, showed the deficiency of the fender mount. When the gun was fired, these headlights would break. That led to changing from a fixed mount on the fender to a removable mount attached to the front armor. Now let's go on and talk about the next specialty half-track. This is the M15 Special. Early in World War II, the Army Ordnance Department experimented with the possibility of mounting a 40 millimeter Bofors anti-aircraft gun on an M3 half-track chassis. That experiment was not successful. The Army Ordnance Department determined that the half-track chassis didn't provide enough stability for accurate fire of the 40mm Bofors gun and terminated the project. Eventually, the Army Ordnance Department developed a different version of a self-propelled 40mm Bofors gun, the M19. That consisted of two 40mm Bofors guns mounted on the chassis of the M24 Chaffee light tank, providing a fully tracked, more stable platform for the anti-aircraft fire. Given that history, what do we have here? This is a 40mm Bofors gun mounted on an M3 half-track chassis. Well, the research shows that in Australia, the Army's 99th Ordnance Depot took it upon itself, in spite of the failure of the main effort to create this kind of weapon system, the 99th Ordnance Depot improvised its own 40mm Bofors guns on M3 half-track chassis and designated them the M15 Special. The difference between the improvised effort in Australia and the earlier failed effort here in the United States is the 99th Ordnance Depot did not intend the 40mm Bofors gun to be used as an anti-aircraft weapon. It was intended to be used for ground support and did not require the level of accuracy needed for anti-aircraft use. So this is really a very rare example of what came to be termed the M15 Special. I couldn't find any data on how many examples of the M15 Special were created, and I don't see any evidence of any other surviving M15 Special other than this one. If any of you have data to the contrary, either on how many versions of this weapon system were created in the first place or on other survivors, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Now, I have no idea why the 99th Ordnance Depot designated this an M15 Special. To me, it's a confusing designation, particularly as we go on to our next half-track, the M15 and the M15A1. The M15 and the M15A1 have really nothing to do with the M15 Special, so to me it's kind of inappropriate nomenclature, but who cares what I think? All right, now we've got the M15. The M15 and M15A1 were substantially the same. The only difference was in the position of the 250 caliber machine guns. Both the M15 and the M15A1 had a 37mm anti-tank gun and two 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns. On the M15, the 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns were mounted slightly above the 37mm anti-tank gun. On the M15A1 that you see here, the 50 caliber machine guns are mounted slightly below the 37mm anti-tank gun. The M15 and M15A1 are sometimes referred to as a multiple gun motor carriage. I also see this series referred to as the combination gun motor carriage, which I think is more appropriate because what's distinctive about the M15 series is it combined an anti-tank weapon with two anti-aircraft weapons. Now let's move down and take a look at the M16 multiple gun motor carriage. The M16 multiple gun motor carriage was not a conversion. White Motor Company manufactured almost 3,000 of these as new production vehicles in 1943 and 1945. The distinguishing characteristic is the 4 machine gun M45 Maxim mount in the bed of the truck. As new production, the M16A1 differed from the original M3 half-track in two respects. First, the M16 had hinged armor that could be folded down to provide clear field of fire for the lower of the two 50 caliber machine guns. Second, unlike with the M3, the M16 multiple gun motor carriage does not have a rear door. Now, originally, this was envisioned to be an anti-aircraft weapon, but by the time M16 multiple gun motor carriages entered into combat, really they were obsolete for purposes of anti-aircraft fire, but they were very effective for ground support fire. The M16 and then its successor, the M16A1 that we'll talk about in a minute, both were used throughout the Korean War. Can you imagine the firepower from these 4 machine guns firing into Chinese human wave attacks and just tearing apart the attacking enemy? The M16 and M16A1 during the Korean War often were referred to as the meat chopper. I want to briefly touch on the M375 tank destroyer half-track. We covered the M375 extensively in a separate video devoted to American tank destroyers in World War II, but for those of you that didn't see that video, I at least want to bring attention to this. So the M375 was standardized in 1941. It consisted of a French World War I towed 75mm howitzer married to an M3 half-track chassis. It was just a stopgap while American industry manufactured the proper tank destroyer, the M10, that started to come off American manufacturing lines as early as November 1942. So that's all I'll say here. Now let's move on to the command half-track. A command half-track is just a mobile command post built into an M3 half-track chassis. I'm not a radio guy, and I won't try to walk through the varieties of radios that were used by command in an armored infantry battalion, for example. But I looked at a table of organization and equipment for armored infantry battalions in 1943 in preparation for this video, and I see that specified was an SCR 300 FM radio set, an SCR 536 AM radio set. In addition, command is going to want to talk with artillery. Artillery had a different radio set. So a command post had to have multiple radio sets. And that's about, as you can see here, you see examples of it here. Now, some of you are really expert in World War II signals and in radios, and you could speak at length, I'm sure, about what we have here, whether this is correct, what's missing, what are the applications of each component of these radio sets here, front and in the back. But I can't do that. Those of you that want to weigh in, please add your expertise to our comments. The last half-track here in the museum that I want to share with you is the M16A1 multiple-gun motor carriage shown in our Korean War display. During the Korean War, we found out we didn't have enough M16 multiple-gun motor carriages, so to add to the original M16s, we created M16A1 multiple-gun motor carriages, converting M3 half-tracks into the M16A1. Since this is a conversion and not an original production, M16 multiple gun motor carriage, you see legacy elements of the original M3. There's a rear door. The side armor does not fold down. Because the side armor doesn't fold down, there's an additional pedestal in the rear of the half-track to elevate the quad 50 caliber machine gun mount to have full field of fire in ground support of American infantry during the Korean War. After World War II, and particularly after the Korean War, the United States phased out half-tracks and replaced them with fully tracked, fully enclosed armored personnel carriers, beginning with the M75, followed by the M59 that we'll cover in future videos. If you like our videos, please subscribe. I look forward to any comments you have, what you like, what you don't like about the video. Thank you for watching.